So this idea of Jesus coming was planned by God. It was something that he had planned out, and he knew when the fullness of time, quote unquote, had come to send him who was to come. God did indeed send forth his Son. This phrase, born of a woman, is also important here in connection with this fullness of time, as it is fulfilling one of the requirements for the Messiah, as it is stated in a very messianic book, Isaiah 7. Chapter 7, verse 14, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. Now there are some scholars, especially Jewish scholars, defending their polemic, who say that this word does not mean virgin. Now the problem with this is twofold. While true context is what provides meaning, the context in this case implies that God is trying to do something that would seem impossible as an unmitigated sign that a young man was in fact the Messiah, and merely having a young maiden give birth, I think, hardly qualifies. The other point is that the word is translated as virgin here in other places, most notably Genesis 24:43. I know that's a little bit of a rabbit hole off of Galatians 4:4, but I just in researching this I felt the need to make that point. The other point making about this verse is that we see Jesus was was born under the law. As was stated a few times throughout the series, Jesus fulfilled the law perfectly as part and parcel of a sinless life, and as part of our as part of our redemption, rather. So we see the fullness of God coming in the form of the Messiah, testified to by a virgin birth and by his ability to perfectly keep the law. That has such weight and such effects on us. I was recently talking via email to a Muslim gentleman, and it's amazing to see how people just really from all other cultures just sort of assume that all things need to be under the law. And when you try and explain those things, when you try and have a conversation with a person who has no idea, who's essentially still born under the law, still lives under the law, you're talking at cross purposes there. But we have Jesus, who was, as the verse here indicates, sent forth, born of a woman and born under the law. And then, his death and resurrection imparted righteousness to us through grace, by grace through faith, and we are no longer under the law. Chris?
All right. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. This idea of fullness of time, many people have asked the question, and I think it's a good one, why didn't Jesus come sooner? One commentator says, "At what time it was expedient that the Son of God should be revealed to the world, it belonged to God alone to judge and determine. This consideration ought to restrain all curiosity. Let no man presume to be dissatisfied with the secret purpose of God and raise a dispute why Christ did not appear sooner. If the reader desires more information on the subject, he may consult, which I've written on the episode." Well, that's Calvin there. But I like Guzik brings up a few good points of why the fullness of time was when it was. He brings up, he's actually quoting a commentator named Boyce when it says, "It was a time when Pax Romana extended over most of the civilized earth, and when travel and commerce were therefore possible in a way that had formerly been impossible." He goes on to talk about the roads and all the diverse regions were linked far more significantly. But I think the language that Alexander the Great sort of, made Koine Greek the language of the known world, and which made the spread of gospel, which we saw later with Paul and his missionary journeys, something that was only recently possible. But I suspect, well, I'll throw one more in there also. That was also the time, exactly 483 years that were prophesied by Daniel were drawing to a close in Daniel 9, verse 24 through 26. But I suspect that if we knew all the reasons why Christ came when he did and not a moment sooner or later, I think our heads would explode or something. It's probably so intense, I'm sure you can dig out all kinds of things if you spend, several sermons could be done on exactly why he showed up when he did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got some more stuff here on this one. God sent forth his son, made of a woman. This phrase is one of many places that shows that Christ is one of the same as God, adding humanity to his divinity. And also in the subtlety of the language, it speaks of the virgin birth because he calls Mary a woman in the Greek word here in respect of the sex and not as the word is used in the contrary sense to a virgin. So, for she remained a virgin still, as the Geneva translator notes say. So the word, they could have used the word for a woman, which meant virgin, but they just called her, it's like saying, but a female, which was significant in the context. The words under the law, that's very significant, as you were bringing forth, that the earthly being of Christ began under the law. He was not only of a human birth, but of Jewish birth, subjected to all the ordinances of the law, as circumcision, for instance, like any other Jewish boy. All right.
Okay, there you go.
And I quoted that last one from somebody, and I can't remember who it was, so that's not me.
Well, that's okay. I mean, it was really good. It's funny to think, it's often, I think we've already mentioned this once or twice in the study of Galatians, but it's funny to think of the world's conception of Jesus and following God. Well, it's funny to think of the world's conception of Jesus, where he's like this nicely coiffed hair and sort of got like this Fabio 80s rock kind of wind blowing through his long sort of combed locks and a neatly trimmed beard. It's interesting to see that with people who have that conception of Jesus oftentimes end up just following that Jesus and just trying to be maybe a little too popular. Whereas the person who's really seems to me, at least to me, following the Jesus who doesn't really look like that, who has had no form, no comeliness, that we should desire him, but, hangs on every word that he says and really tries to do it, really sort of ends up alienating some people sometimes. But, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with all this.
Well, I'll just throw this in there. Sometimes I'll notice the way that Jesus speaks to people and teaches in the Bible. It's really abrasive,
Yeah, but he was pretty gnarly to some people.
I mean, he doesn't waste. It's like he didn't waste any time, I think, is what it really boils down to. He's had 3 years of ministry, and he didn't sugarcoat any of it. I mean, he spoke in hyperbole, which was shocking to some people, and but yeah, we're probably going off on some trail here. But
yeah, dun, 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 rabbit trail. Let's see, verse. What are we on? Verse 5 here.
Yeah.
Okay. Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4, verse 5. To redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. So again, we see Paul making the point that Jesus redeemed us from under the law's requirements and jurisdictions into a more better and excellent way. We've made this point several times. We'll just keep making it because it's important. It's interesting to note that Paul makes the exact same point earlier in the letter to start this line of thinking when he says in verse 13, chapter 3 of Galatians, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. He also makes the same point later on in Galatians, again when he writes, Galatians chapter 3, verse 26, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. This echoes, of course, what he writes strongly in Romans, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. And then Romans 8:15, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father, which later he writes later on here. While it's interesting to note that this sonship and this holy adoption is a one-time act, it's also a new way of viewing the world and of viewing life. When you were adopted, you are made whole and given eternity, essentially. Well, not essentially, you are. We need to keep that in view, I think, for so often we get the idea that it's only a one-time act and miss the fact that part of what we do is like have a redeemed life, from under the law, so we might receive adoption as sons, and this really plays out a lot of times when I think speaking personally, there are times when I think, I had problems with that sin or this sin, but I've got it beat now. And what ends up happening is pretty much as soon as the words are out of my mouth, those elementary principles that are mentioned here and in other books of the Bible that Paul refers to go to work on me, because I've essentially gotten out from under the grace that is sort of keeping me from that, from sinning in whatever way that is. And then you fall and you go, gosh, how could I have that happen? What happened? And it's like, well, you stopped you stopped sort of faithing, if you will. I don't know. I'm speaking off the top of my head here. It just sort of seemed like an interesting point to make. But I've already digressed enough, so I'll stop.
I'll stop there. Okay.
Yeah.